Hello, are you here to debate?
Yes, I am.
All right. Can I just get your name, age, and pronouns, please?
Ryan, 26. He.
Okay, Ryan, what topic on the board are you here to debate about?
Man, I'm willing to do any of them. I'd say minus the Christianity one. Is there one that like people don't typically bring up that you've been kind of itching to talk about?
I'll do whatever one you want.
Okay. Leave it up to me. Let's go with. I'd like to touch on pro-choice because I was there for the second to last caller. I think there's some points that I would like to elaborate on that you made, and then I would say we can go into. We could spread it off from there. I'll probably branch into pro-choice, and then probably branch off into the LGBT topics. I would prefer.
Okay. Sure. What did you want to elaborate on about the pro-choice position?
So I would like to dive a little bit deeper. I'm, I think if I completely laid out my beliefs, you would probably label me as pro-choice. Pro-life. And looking at your justification and kind of like your logical pathway of following, like the consent idea, I'd like to rehash that. So if you wouldn't mind, could you restate like kind of your idea on like how consent, you're not consenting necessarily to having a child whenever you have sex, therefore the consent argument can't really be followed through with like the rape argument, I guess, whereas most pro-lifers draw the exception for. So I'm assuming, I don't want to like mischaracterize or misunderstand where you're at on that.
Well, drawing the exception is only logically coherent if you believe that the reason that the reason abortion is not justified is because consent to sex is consent to pregnancy. Any other time you draw an exception for rape or incest, any other time it would be logically inconsistent with the pro-life stance. So if you're saying, well, it's a human being, so you shouldn't kill it, but also I make exceptions, then you're not consistent because those fetuses in the case of rape and incest are still human beings. However, the problem is when people then say consent to sex is consent to pregnancy, it doesn't really hold weight because when it comes to actions and reactions and things, you acknowledge that consenting to an action is not consent to all of the outcomes of said action. It's an acknowledgement that those things might happen, but acknowledging that something might happen is not consent to that thing happening. So because, again, somebody is not consenting to pregnancy, I would say that, they should not be forced to maintain the pregnancy.
So, I mean, is that saying that, like, you're drawing that distinction between having to deal with, like, the consequences of your actions or potential actions? Of course, like, the most baseline is, like, I walk out my door, there's a threat of me being raped in the streets, Of course, it's like you can logically pull that far back, and it doesn't necessarily mean that, like, you have to bear the burden of whatever consequence comes your way. But, in any action that you're doing, can you ever even say you're consenting to any of the possible reactions to any action?
No, because you can't consent to something until it... Wait, the reason why is because you can't consent to something until it happens, right?
Exactly. Or
so when somebody says, like...
If you consent during sex, it doesn't necessarily mean you're consenting, or there's also a possibility that you don't even fully know what your consent level is,
Well, I would just say that in the example of sex, if I consent to sex a week ago, that does not, like, if I say a week before today, or if I say a week from today, I want to have sex with this person, and me and this person agree, and we're like, yeah, we're going to have sex 5 days from now. 5 days can come. That previous us saying we want to have sex is not consent. Not until the action is engaging are we consenting. We acknowledge that there's a chance of us having sex, but we could get there in that moment and go, we don't want to have sex anymore. right? So that
Well, it
previous
could be a
consent
millisecond
doesn't
before,
hold.
and also you can claim non-consensual afterwards, and that's why, like, I kind of argue like that the consent idea. I mean, the general concepts of consent, I think it's impossible to be hard set in stone because at some point it's unprovable. You know, because I mean, you could just say, I mean, it's all up in your head. You know, I could just say, no, actually, I didn't consent to that, though I completely told you, yes, I want to have sex. That person might not be at fault, but there's still, you know, implications that you can draw from that. But regardless, you know, I just wanted to elaborate on how consent fell into it. I would definitely say that just because you're not consenting to having a child, doing the act, which is the only way to produce a child, and it's not like it's something that you have to be taught. I mean, I guess technically in a way, it's one of the most well-known basic biological things that exists. If I have sex, a child can be produced out of this. And what's even more important is the only way, the entire purpose of having sex in the first place, the entire purpose of feeling the need to have sex is for procreation. So to me, you're taking that entire idea and you're removing the entire point of it out to just draw an exception to say, well, I'm not consenting to the outcome, therefore I can enjoy the fruits of what makes me desire this and not have to have any of the negative outcomes. I can wipe away any of the negative outcomes.
Yeah,
and I know
the question becomes that you need to answer. Just really quick, the question you now need to answer is telling me why. Like, let's say I do have sex and I consented to the sex and now I'm pregnant. Why is abortion unjustified? It can't be that abortion is unjustified because you had sex, because that, again, we've already determined that, like, you can't, the act of being and remaining pregnant is separate from the act of having sex. They are two separate acts.
Both are inseparable in themselves. It's like
Doesn't
saying
matter.
step one has nothing to do with step two.
Wait.
And you can never have step two without step one.
Them being linked in the chain doesn't matter. You still have to consent to every part of the chain, right? Again.
Sure. Okay. So I didn't consent to being pregnant, but I decided to keep my child. Do I have to consent to raising my child then?
Yes.
Or I can withdraw consent. Or at a later date, say, actually, looking back, I didn't consent to this pregnancy. I decided to go through with having the child. That's not how consent
works, and you know
that. But it wasn't consensual, and I never spoke up about it. Therefore, I relinquished rights to my child.
Wait. That's not how consent works. Consent is not something where you can go, okay, I consented to the action. I now did the action, but now 10 years later, now I pull my consent back. No, consent can only be revoked
that's still part of that chain that you're saying that is completely separable.
No,
how is it not?
Consent to an action or revoking consent from an action can only be done while that action is occurring.
I didn't say revoke consent. I said you never spoke up about consent in the first place. And again, scenario A,
you consenting to a pregnancy.
To having sex. Say I had a rape child, so the most classic version of non-consent. I decided to actually have that child. Say it's trauma, say it's whatever. Decided to go through with it, or maybe I was extremely pro-life and felt bad about aborting a child. If, say, the child is 1, I look back on it, I get massive clarity in mind, and I say, I absolutely did not consent to this.
You did consent to it.
You consented to being raped?
No, you consented to the pregnancy by maintaining the pregnancy.
So you can stop it at pregnancy, but you can't stop it. And we're just talking about consent and having to deal with actions. We're not saying any human life at this point. We're just saying we're just classifying it into the responsibility. Because what is the negative of having a child? It's not that a new life isn't here. It's not that there's having a child is inherently bad. It is the responsibilities that come with having that child and having to go through pregnancy in the first place.
Yeah, there's tons of negatives with being pregnant and having kids, right? There's tons of negatives with this.
Absolutely, and that's why people would have an abortion. Otherwise, if it was wouldn't matter.
Hold on, Ryan, hold on. When it comes to raising the child, the way you can revoke consent is by giving up the kid. You give up the kid. You've revoked your consent. That would be the revoke of consent at that point.
But why would you have to, why would you not be by default stripped of responsibility of having to take care of that child if you did not consent to it?
Why would you be?
Why would you not immediately not have to do anything with the child?
That's not a justification. What are you talking about? This quite literally isn't a justification for that claim. You would have to justify for this claim why somebody should no longer be allowed. Like, it should be the default that somebody is not allowed to, or somebody's rights for the child are stripped away because they were raped.
I'm not saying, no, I'm saying that you would ultimately always have the option to not have to deal with that consequence that was brought upon you.
You do. If you consent to giving birth, but you don't consent to raising the child, then you give it up at the hospital. You give it up to the state. You do. You literally always do. What are you talking about?
Why couldn't you just leave that child? Why
you can. Why does it have to? Why do you have safe drop locations. What are you talking about? You can literally, when you give birth to it at the hospital, you just say, I don't want it, and the hospital takes it and you have to do nothing. You do nothing here, Ryan. What are you talking about?
Fair enough, but my argument on that is, that is infinitely expandable, is it not?
No.
So those methods of like early on adoption go out of the way, and it's not necessarily a clear pathway. And if you have genuinely no responsibilities tied to the consequence, then why do you have to do anything? Why do you have to care about anything at all? Why do you have to follow any logical? I want to say logical, any moral pathway of making sure that child is actually going to be taken care of.
Yeah, because the child is now a sentient being. Therefore, the child now receives moral consideration. And because the child now receives moral consideration, it's a bad thing if you do something that intentionally harms something with moral consideration that is not justified. And there is no justification for you just dropping the kid in the woods, right? There's no justification for that.
No,
Especially when
it's easier
on
human life.
I'm
speaking
just give it to the hospital.
The actual responsibility aspect.
Yes,
so that's like the negative aspect that you're trying to solve through abortion.
Your responsibility is to transfer that responsibility. You can give up your consent but you must transfer that responsibility to somebody else because the child is a moral agent.
You deal with the burden no matter what. So you do have to face consequences to your actions regardless.
What every action has consequences. Yes. Nobody's saying they don't. You're the one who's saying that there are specific consequences that you can't handle, right? You're saying if the consequence is pregnancy, there's only certain ways you can deal with that consequence. You can't do it any way that you want. You can only deal with it in certain ways. You're placing a restriction on the way you deal with the consequences.
What I'm saying is using consent as the what do you call that? Like the vehicle to justify if you have to deal with the responsibility of your actions or not does not line up, and it won't line up on. I could probably come up with like a thousand. I'm going to tell you right now. I'm going to tell you. Wait,
Ryan, stop. I have been very logically consistent in this. You are saying that, hey, when it comes to revoking consent, you shouldn't have to do anything to revoke consent. You should just have to do it. No, you always have to make some sort of affirmative in order to revoke consent, right? Like you have to do something to revoke that consent when it comes to pregnancy. Now, if we're in a society where there's like zero laws, then yeah, I guess if you want to just drop your baby in the woods because there's no legal ramification against it, fucking go nuts. But what I'm saying here is because this fetus is a moral actor, right? Because it's a moral actor, because it has moral consideration, we now consider it immoral for you to engage in an action that intentionally harms this fetus that is no longer justified. And dropping it off in the woods would be one of those actions, whereas if you give birth in the hospital and you have the doctor there, all you do is you say 5 words. You say 5 words. The doctor says, here's your baby. You go, I don't want that baby. And then you're done.
I'm not arguing with that at all. Not even remotely. I'm just saying using consent as the justification.
Consent is not the justification. I don't think you listened to the last conversation. Consent was not the justification.
Not using consent. So not having consent, if it's technically you're not consenting to the outcome of X action, that doesn't add up because consent can be infinitely scalable and infinitely pulled back because you are truly the only person to determine if you consented or not.
We've already gone through about how consent cannot be infinitely scaled back. We've already gone through that. that it's not something you can do. You can only consent to an action while that action is ongoing. Therefore, it cannot be infinitely regressed.
How do we measure that, though? How do we measure that?
While the action is going, we have the person give an affirmative or a negative. What do you mean? How do we measure it? We measure it with somebody saying yes or no.
It's only in your head, so you don't say a word. So you do say a word. So you can infinitely. There's nothing tangible to ever attach to consent.
Consent
is always up to the individual to say, okay, I lied about consenting. I actually did not consent.
Ryan, consent is a social construct. There is no objective thing I can pull out of the air that is the consent fairy. That is like, this is consent here, guys. So what are you talking about?
So using that as the basis of
it's not the basis. This is the problem. You didn't Ryan, you didn't understand. You didn't understand the last conversation. You didn't understand the last conversation. If you're saying this is the basis of justification for abortion, it's not. It's the counter for saying consent to sex is consent to pregnancy. You want to go a route here, and say that like, well, because consent is infinitely regressible, then consent to sex is consent to pregnancy. Well, great. I can do that for literally everything. You got into a car accident, consent to getting into your car is consent to the accident. You don't get to go to the hospital because you consented to the accident. So you agree people shouldn't be allowed to get into a car. You agree people shouldn't be allowed to go to the hospital after they get into a car accident?
No, what I'm saying is using consent as that line. Using consent to the outcome as that line.
No, you don't understand what I just said. Your position that it's infinitely regressible is the position that leads to absurdity. Because by your logic, that it's in, which it is not, because we've went through this, but by your logic, you're saying that if you get into a car accident, you are not allowed to go to the hospital. Anything you do, you're not allowed to get help for it because consent is infinitely regressible. So therefore, how do we know you didn't consent to this action? That's what you're saying.
No, okay, and that's what I'm saying is using that as a baseline.
That wasn't my baseline.
I'm not saying my baseline wasn't using that as a justification for not taking responsibilities for an unknown outcome can be applied towards everything, and it's illogical in almost every single stance. So how is it not illogical? You don't know what argument
you literally don't know what argument you're arguing for here, because this is not my argument. The argument I'm laying out for you is your position on the argument. This is what you're saying. So because it's your position, it's not my position, right? Because I can say consent is not infinitely regressible. Therefore, consent to an action is not consent to its action. You're saying, you're putting in the affirmative that consent is infinitely regressible. That is your affirmative in this position. Therefore, based on your position and your logic, nobody should ever be able to receive medical care for anything because everyone has consented to every bad thing that's ever happened to them because we can't prove consent. That's your claim, not my claim. My claim is we can prove consent. Therefore, consent is not infinitely regressible. Therefore, we should give people medical care for things because they didn't consent to these things.
I agree, but we do not operate off of that method. So therefore, if I'm unconscious on the side of the road, you assume consent, even if the person didn't consent to it, and they're basically free of any backlash. You know, if an ambulance picked me up and I was unconscious,
we assume consent in areas where the person is not able to give an affirmative when it comes to like life-saving measures, unless they have like a DNI or DNR. If they have a DNR, then we don't assume consent because they clearly. Like if they have on their chest, do not resuscitate and a giant tattoo, then we go, oh, because we don't know what this person said when they were conscious, we're erring on the side of life. But if we do know what they said when they were conscious, we don't do that. Because it is provable. Because that's the provable part.
I mean, I'm not denying that like the entirety idea of consent is kind of in a gray area and we're kind of picky choosy on it. You know, it's like you're messing with what's for the greater good, what is like the most morally correct thing to do at this exact moment. There's always exceptions and risks to anything that you do. I'm just saying that saying that I did not consent to the outcome of having sex is an improvable. You cannot prove that could even exist in the first place. You can't prove that someone could even ever have consent in the first place. Therefore, it's not a very good marker to ever say.
We can prove consent exists. Something being arbitrary or something being an abstract concept does not mean we can't prove that that thing exists. It just means that that thing is individualized.
I think you literally just said that was a social concept and it's not anything tangible. How you can't prove that it exists if it only resides in the individual's mind.
Ryan, let me ask you a question, Ryan. Let me ask you a question. Do you have friends?
Yes, sir, I do.
Okay, well, friendship is a social construct, so I guess you don't actually have friends, because how can you prove that your friends are really your friends? How can you prove friendship is real?
I can't say that friendship, the proof that I have a friendship with somebody is the baseline reason why I don't have to face the consequences of something negative that comes out of that.
No, you're twisting it. That's not what I said. You said that we can't prove social constructs, which is just not true. We can prove these things are real. They might not be objective.
Again, like it's elaborating of the human mind.
You can't all subjective things, but that doesn't mean they don't exist.
I mean, and a responsibility is in the same category as that. Again, what I'm saying is you cannot use that as justification. Okay, we're dealing with, I'm having sex. Should I be responsible for the child that is produced out of having sex? The only reason I'm having sex is for my own self-pleasure. The negative consequence that comes, or the quote-unquote, it could be negative consequence.
No, because you'd have to justify why you were responsible.
Into this world, should I have to have responsibility because I did the only and single action that brings the human life into this world?
You would have to justify. You would have to justify why you're responsible. It can't be a circle. You can't say, I'm responsible for this because I had sex, therefore I'm responsible for this fetus because I had sex. That's a circle. You're not proving that, you're not justifying the responsibility. But let me ask you a really quick question.
The shortest and smallest circle that is possible.
Ryan, I have a real quick question. The only reason of sex is for procreation. The only reason of sex is for procreation. So there's no excuse to ever fall behind. Ryan, you are not justifying your claim. You're just giving a circle. Let me ask you a question. Did you consent to being on this call today?
Did I consent to being born?
To being on this phone call today?
No, you'll never know.
Okay, well, if you did, here's the
maybe
consent
someone held
to
a gun to my head.
Shout out to fucking Christ, bro. You'll never know. What the fuck? What's up, everybody? Thanks for watching this video, and I want to give a special shout out to my YouTube members. Their names are on the side. Membership starts at $2.99 a month, and you get early access to videos, exclusive members-only videos, and access to the Red Mirror Media Discord server. Thank you again to my members, and thanks for watching.